So if you've any interest in coaching, the Mike Quirk podcast is definitely well worth a listen. It's available weekly on the OTB GAA podcast stream. Mike, I'm sure many of you know, is currently coach of the All-Ireland winning Kerry footballers. Every week he's talking with some of the leading thinkers and voices in the world of coaching. And I was listening to one of them recently, a fascinating conversation with the former Kerry captain, Fionn Fitzgerald. He's also a lecturer down in MTU in Kerry. And it was a really interesting conversation around the work that Fionn is doing with his PhD around relative age effect, biobanding, maturation rates of academy players in the GAA. It is a fascinating subject and we wanted to explore it a bit more in the show this evening. To do that, I'm joined by Dr. Laura Finnegan, who's lecturer and researcher in talent development in the Southeast Technological University, and also Mark O'Sullivan, who is head of football at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences and also lectures in skill acquisition. Laura, Mark, good to talk to you.
Hi, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks very much. Greetings from Stockholm, and I'm in Stockholm at the moment.
Thanks for joining us, Mark. Laura, I know you've done a huge amount of research on relative age effect. For the layman, what is it?
It's an overrepresentation of players born just after the cutoff point for a particular sport. So in most cases, it would be January. So often particularly in male team sports, in early adolescence, we will see a lot of January, February and March children being picked for representative squads or A teams, whatever that looks like in your sport.
Your research has been mainly around football, but just how prevalent is it then as you've looked through the academy systems right the way up to the senior international squad?
Yeah, my own research is football based, but it's not a phenomenon that's completely unique to football. It's present in most team and invasion type sports, and particularly where we're making direct comparisons between one player and another. So yeah, the interesting thing about the relative age effect is that it fluctuates and it changes across the lifespan of a sport. So for example, we've seen from research that it actually kicks in quite early. There's been studies in French football that it starts at 7 or 8. So there is a parental aspect to this too, that maybe actually parents are a little bit hesitant about putting in their later born kids and maybe kind of missing that summer. So that can happen there, and it can come the whole way through a pathway. It tends to really come to the fore in terms of selections. So where selections take place or are made, well, that's where we will see this emphasis on the early born players. Why? Well, I suppose again it comes back to culture, and if the culture is win and win at all costs, well, then we will tend to select the early born boys. But in terms of some of the stats we know from the research, there's a relatively even spread across the year. And in the relative age effect research, we talk about quarters. So quarter one being January, February and March, right up to quarter four, which is October, November and December. So there's a general split. It might be a 24% or 26 and 25% here or there, but it's a relatively even spread. But I would have done a research piece a few years ago about the Emerging Talent Programme, and there was almost 40% of boys selected for that were from these first 3 months of the year. Almost 75% born in the first half of the year compared to 25% in the second half. And that was perpetuated, like it's been shown elsewhere as well, that the more players that are competing for places, that this will get stronger. So if I took the DDSL clubs, for example, out of that sample, 44% of all boys there were born in the first 3 months of the year, the boys from the DDSL that were selected onto ETP. And that continues in that vein. I mean, we done a study recently looking at all of the men's and women's Euros over the past few years at different age groups from 17, 19 and senior. Again, at 17, we see that 46% of the boys are born in the first quarter of the year, and only 7% born in the last 3 months. And the stats sound just 6 times more likely to reach an under 17 squad, international squad, if you were born early in the year. That reduces a little bit to 19. It's kind of 3 times more likely. And then at senior, there's different patterns. It's not as prevalent there. It still tends to have that effect comes the whole way through from underage, but it's not as stark as some of the earlier stats.
Well, even I was looking at Stephen Kenny's latest squad for the last internationals of 24 players. 14 of them were born on or before May the 1st. And the other 10 were born in the final 2/3 of the year. And I know obviously date of birth is a very blunt instrument. It was interesting though to see that of the players who were born in the final 3 months of the year, there was only 4 of them. But John Egan and Evan Ferguson, both of their fathers were footballers. So there's, I think when you look at the stats, a natural advantage there as well. And the other 2 were Seamus Coleman and Caoimhín Kelleher, who are going to be playing at maybe the highest level and are maybe just freakish in their talent that they've also managed to break through.
Yeah, and this can be negated by other maybe advantages that you might have. So we might find that actually if there's some quarter fours in there, they tend to be biological early maturers, and that really, when we come into the academy system, it becomes more about your timing and your tempo and your rate of maturation in comparison to your peers. If you are an early maturer, you'll tend to get ahead. I think there was a recent study done, and there were no late maturers in the under 15 and under 16 Irish underage squad. So, but again, when we look at, and it's interesting you brought up the international teams, because often what's happening, we have to look at the full pathway, because sometimes coaches are selecting from an already skewed pathway, and that's why it's really important to even utilize something like the player databases, like the benefit of having something like FAI Net or FAI Connect to be able to show that across the full spectrum of the sport at all levels, at under 13 national academies, 2 international teams, and across the League of Ireland as well.
Mark, from what you've seen, is it as simple as 7, 8-year-olds going to a club for the first time, and like for an 8-year-old who's born in January, there's almost, there can be 11 months between them and the guy born in December. There can be a huge difference in height, in weight, in maturity, in skill level, in the amount of practice that they put in, and that initial interaction is that they are one of the more talented players. They're given more time, and that just continues for the rest of their playing days.
I think we have to give it some context here, because Laura's brought up some really very important research, particularly research specific to Ireland. And I mean, really, if we're looking at the system that 7-year-old will say is going into, it's basically a linear chronological system. Under 7, under 8, under 9, under 10, etc. But the individual that is participating in that system is basically a non-linear biological complex system. And this means that its development is non-linear, while the development of the system itself, the player development system, the different age groups that they play in, that's quite linear. The individual is very, very non-linear in their development. And Laura touched on the words there like maturation. You can have a 7-year-old even a 7-year-old. Don't even have to go to teenage growth spurts and things like that. You can have a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old that has probably biologically you could look at as 9 or 10, or biologically it could be 6. So we can have vast differences of 2, 3, 4 years biologically between individuals. But the issue is that we must remember is that we're very over constrained by the chronological linear system. So that's the context I think we really need to give to these, because it's very easy at 7, 8, 9, if you're biologically older, it's quite easier to look quite good.
Could you talk about that, Laura, the maturation rates, because it probably is taken to that deeper level again as to how you would work that out in terms of research?
Well, the gold standard for year was skeletal X-rays, but now there are ways of doing that in terms of taking mid-parental height. So a Calmus Roach is a method of doing that, and there is a database of that with a margin of error. But we can tend then to identify whether kids are early on time or late matures, particularly in that kind of round puberty time. Again, you could have two kids playing against each other at under 13, and maybe there's a spread across that pitch of 5 to 6 years difference, actual maturation differences. So that's really, really important. And again, there was a really large selection bias in favour of selecting these early maturing players. And it's, we call it the unicorn almost. It's very rare that you will have a late maturing player that's also a quarter four. They tend to be spat out of the system really early if they've ever got a chance to engage in it at all. So the relative age effect and biological maturation are different. They're different concepts. Sometimes they're kind of wrapped up together. But
so when you talk about some of those development squads not having any late developers, it's not necessarily that they're the final 3 months of the year, but they are more likely to be from the final 3 months of the year.
Yeah, they're different. They are different. The biological maturation is an inherent genetic. So if your parents went through their growth spurt and the process of puberty earlier, well, then you probably will too. So about 70% of us are on time, and the others are outside of that. But again, there's been studies across academies in the UK, and that by the time it gets to maybe under 17 or under 18, the late maturing boys just didn't stand a chance in terms of that continued selection process, whereas the relative age effect is about the calendar, and it really hits its peak in terms of impact really before maturation. And after that, then that kind of mid-teenage years, biological maturation seems to take over in terms of a real driver of selection. But it's still present. The domino effects of the relative age effect are still there, and we see it. So the quarter four kids are more likely to drop out as well, because again, it's those early born kids, they're more likely to be captains, they're more likely to be selected, and that's all because this, I suppose, advanced maybe psychosocial cognition, behavioral development, decision making, and they're getting all this positive feedback about their football performance, and that's increasing their confidence and increasing their motivation to come back training as well. So there are the two things there that we do need to consider.
So Mark, is it too simplistic to say that for 30% of kids who come in, those late maturers, that we're not giving them a chance, whether to even, certainly not to get to elite level, but even in terms of participation?
Yeah, I think again, it's still the issue is that we have these such chronological systems, and if you're having systems that are selecting children early, the best way for your system to work is to deselect as many as possible, as early as possible, because then the survivors are the ones that are left with you. So then you're actually narrowing the playing pool. For me, Laura's work is more around relative age effect and maturity, and my work is more towards research has been into pedagogy and designing learning environments for children. And our work has some good crossover, actually. But for me, a lot of this, what you're talking about, is a question of pedagogy, a question of coaching, a question. You know, if some club wants to select early and another person says they don't, we end up with this polarized debate, because often the selection is very much, as Laura's highlighted, sometimes it's probably based on a lot of maturation and kids born early in the year or whatever. But if we want to, like, instead of having this polarized debate, for me, the question is, what is your understanding of human learning and development? That's the key question here. And that bleeds into my work and Laura's work, which is around maturation and development as well, and around pedagogy. So they're the real questions that we really need to be asking, I think, in this debate. I don't know, what do you think, Laura?
Yeah, I suppose to follow on from that, it's about maybe what this looks like on the ground. I know, Mark, you've made some strides in AIK and your time there to try and remove and reduce the relative age effect.
Yeah, the thing is, it's what we found, in particularly in the 8 to 13 section, was that we had quite mixed groups. We'd have 100 kids in each age group, and we'd have probably about divided into 5-6 groups. But there was no selection, and the groups were formed by communities, by friendships, etc. And all we encourage the coaches to do is to not have cemented groups, because there's fantastic potential in having different constellations when they're playing games. And yeah, part of that is having the better players playing with the better players at certain stages. But also, it's not something that's cemented. So it's not something you do all the time. You try to mix it, because the part of this debate could end up being interpreted by some people as, oh, we need to buy a band, we need to have just certain maturers playing. No, because there's also great learning opportunities for children to be playing against players that are probably a bit more mature than them. So I'm a very big advocate for trying to having different constellations within your group as much as possible, so it's not cemented teams, particularly in the younger age groups, because we really need to keep children in the sport, and we need to. It's a great opportunities to help them with simple values like how do we make each other better, which kind of comes in handy when you're playing elite football.
How does that work out then in practicality if you have a training session and you have 10-year-olds training with 14-year-olds or 10-year-olds training with 7-year-olds in terms of out on a pitch, making sure that the 7-year-old actually gets involved and it isn't just the 10-year-olds dominating everything?
Oh, I see. Well, the thing is, we have in each age group, we had when I was at AK, we had 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, but in each age group was 100 kids. But then we had extra training where kids had the opportunity to play with a year older and a year younger, and we tried to keep it as random as possible when we divided them up into groups. And so that took away a lot of the social status, you could say. So, and then as they got to around 10 or 11, there was opportunities for them to train a couple of times a month with some kids with a year older. So there was never anything cemented about any of their journey. They were never part of my group of players because I'm at this level or I'm at the top level, so I only train with these. So we tried to keep the system as open as possible.
From the sounds of what you're saying, Laura, the late maturing players are basically starting to be left behind from day one.
Around the time of puberty, yeah, absolutely. What's interesting as well is that this all manifests differently with women's soccer as well. And as we know that there is a sports science research gap across the board in terms of female sport. And in terms of the relative age affected sport, there's been varied results, I suppose, for females, and it's quite inconclusive there. So in that UEFA study that I referenced in terms of all of the European Championships, so the under 17 level for boys, as I mentioned, it was really clear, 75% of boys born in the first half of the year. But actually for the females, it was 57%. So it doesn't manifest itself the same there. So there's still actually a lot of learning to be done there. Why? In terms of, well, is it the depth of competition hypothesis that some propose, that actually if there's less people putting kind of upward pressure for selection, well, then there will be a more even spread, of course, across the quarters. It might even be somewhat linked to development stages for girls there as well, because girls are going through puberty on average about 2 years earlier than boys. So often all of that has kind of leveled out before the selection takes place. And we're seeing a difference even in terms of kind of psychosocial functionings there too, whereas if we talk about maturation, being an early mature is seen as a real status symbol for boys, and these late maturers might select something else to do, whereas the research is conflicting with girls, that actually some girls are really shy about the changes in their bodies compared to peers, and they are the ones that might deselect from the sport. So yeah, we're still picking this apart and learning a lot about some of the mechanisms behind what is driving this, because we know that the relative age effect exists in non-physical domains as well. So there is a relative age effect in education, and kids born in that kind of that September, October, that the relatively older kids in the classroom will do better in standardized tests as well. So it's much broader. People tend to lump these two concepts together because we think relative age effect is just about size and physical development. But because we've seen it in education and we see it in chess and things like that might not have the same physical domain, it's important to just look at them separately too.
But that's the issue with phonological systems.
Mark, if you look at on the sporting side, like there's the participation point which we might get to, but on the elite side, and trying to identify and bring more of those late maturing players and keep them in the system so you have more options as you go through the various age groups. If you look around Europe, are there countries who are leading the way in this? Where do Ireland rank in terms of how we're trying to progress?
Well, I can't comment on Ireland, but I know that we had the Dutch FA over visiting us in 2019, and they sat with me and a few friends from our research and development department. We did some coaching together with them, and they went back and they did. They've started now this 40 club project, relatively based on our work, and it's trying to keep as many systems open in clubs as possible. And now there's a few of the top clubs in Holland have joined in with that group also. So there are countries starting to work with these ideas. I know you've heard probably stuff from Belgium as well, but the thing is, you can't really copy and paste what somebody does in Ireland and what you do in Belgium or what you do in Australia or wherever. But it is something, I think, because there was a really powerful research came out. I think it was 2020. And that they did, there was research done on 29 top academies in the world, I think it was. And the turnover rate every year of players was around 30% in and out. So even that system itself is probably slightly malfunctioning as well. So, it's definitely something. But I go back to it. The thing is, this discussion needs to be based around our understanding of human learning and development, because I think polarized debates, and both Laura and I have been meeting people and we've had contact for years, and the debate is very polarized, Laura, about early selection and this selection and not selection. And even though I don't think we should be selecting kids early, but I think we really need to start talking about, what's our understanding of human learning and development, and how our systems over constraining the opportunities for children to participate, to perform and reach their potential.
So is that a coach education plan that needs to be put in place, Mark? Because I think the majority of coaches, say at underage level, are probably parents of children who go in and want to help out and want to volunteer and want to do the right thing, but also are thinking about picking the best 15 players for the team eventually, and are looking at every player and analysing their skill set, and I'd imagine 99% not thinking that deeply about relative age effect, about, well, actually, that player right now might be one of the smaller players. Look at his dad, and he's 6'5". He's probably going to end up in 6'5" at some stage, and has the skill set, but isn't been picked on the team and been probably ruled out of it far too early. So that sounds like something that needs a much greater process from the very top of the major sporting organisations.
And I think it can be a coach education. There can be a coach education solution, or partly a solution for this, but I think it should be across all sports, and maybe have it something that's in schools as well, because this debate is so polarized around youth sport. I'm finding that we really, really, really need to start talking about human learning and development, and how humans learn, develop, and how our systems over constrained. So I think you're right. It is a coach education thing, possibly. I think that would be a good way to start. But this takes you a bit away from the X's and the O's and things like that, and gets down to the working with the human and individual that's standing in front of you that you're coaching.
Laura, go on, Laura. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree there with the education piece, and sometimes there's more to it in terms of where this education fits best. So I know that it is something that's tackled at maybe the elite youth license, but actually, if we're seeing that the relative age effect is coming in and having an impact from before these kids are in double digits, well, then we actually need to try and get it into the Kickstart 1s and Kickstart 2s, because that's the qualification that those coaches have. But sometimes education alone is hitting it head against a brick wall if the culture is still very much to be the winning under 10 coach. And yeah, there's other probably admin heavy suggestions that are often thrown out there in terms of the relative age effect, in terms of whether we should rotate age bands. So it's not always the 1st of January, but actually it rotates in 9 months. So across the developmental stages, you will probably have experience in being both the youngest and the oldest across those bands. But I absolutely would see for me, a key role would be that the flexibility of our development pathway systems, whatever language that we use to support this non-linear development. So it's not just the focus on our underage League of Ireland squads, but actually, we need to think broader than that. We need to think about, how do we keep the second tier and those engaged with clubs still ready to make that step up. And I think in terms of the education, there was did a study for UEFA last year across 7 European countries, and 80% of Irish clubs recognise that growth and maturation status of a youth player can have an impact on perceptions of his or her talent. So, to me, I think the education is there to some extent, but maybe impeded by the culture. But probably what we don't get enough of in terms of education is actually kind of trying to bust some of these talent development myths. And that might be, well, the idea of when we can actually ID, to use that term, when we can ID talent, and actually Irish clubs rated the highest of across the countries in Europe, saying that that is possible for most players between the ages of 6 to 12 to be identified. So if we have that mindset that actually we can spot players early, and again, almost 50% said that their talent and ability is stable and progresses at that linear rate, well, then of course it makes sense that we're in this environment where we're selecting kids early, because that's what we think works. And I think that, we can do it, but the stats don't bear that out either. I think 5% of the under 15s have got an international cap. So there's a lot to consider, and sometimes we don't talk about the quarter ones enough. We have a vast overrepresentation of quarter ones at the mid teenage years, but actually it's more level when we come to senior. So where have they gone as well? Have they not had enough challenge maybe that our quarter fours have had throughout their development?
Well, I might play a couple of clips then, if that's all right, Laura, just from, I mentioned Fionn Fitzgerald in the podcast he was on, and the work that he's undertaking in MTU and Kerry around relative age and biobanding and maturation rate. So he was talking about the types of players who are being sent into the inter-county academies. I think they had a particular focus obviously on the Kerry Academy. Here's what he had to say about that.
Often club coaches send their 3 or 4 best players to the trials. Mm-hmm. And then you have your 3 or 4 best players, and you've, 100 players maybe in trials or whatever it is over a period of time. But what we love to look at is actually the players that are coming to the trials. I suspect that maybe the pool of players coming into the trials is already potentially biased towards early maturing players, mm-hmm. which is started by the club players, because inevitably your club coach sends his 3 or 4 best players who possibly are the guys who are the early maturing guys and running the show, for want of a better word, So you, basically what it looks like, Mike, in this, from what we've seen in this, is that, and similar to soccer and other sports, that you need to be extremely you need to be really good and really determined, and you need to have something special if you're a late maturing player, okay? Or you need to have coaches who are really open to keeping the net wide and so on. And in fairness to coaches, when we kind of showed some of this information back to them, we'll say the second year there was a lot of kind of a lot of interest in it from their end, and they were definitely thinking about it a little bit differently, which was interesting. And they were
yeah. I don't think that would come as a massive surprise to anybody, Laura, Mark, that club coaches send their 3 biggest, strongest players, and they're not at 14 or 15 when they're sending them to academies thinking, well, actually, this guy here might be the better player when he's 18 or 19. They're sending the best players there and then. Fiona also talked about something you touched on of maybe those quarter one early developers. Are they being tested enough? So as an experiment, they changed their training games. So the early maturers were playing against each other and the late maturers were playing against each other. He just spoke about the results they had from that.
So the first of all, the late maturing guys said, this is brilliant. So essentially, normally I'm playing corner forward and I don't get any ball in the game, and if I do, I can't. All the big guys are running the show, and basically I can't really do what I was able to do today. So I was able to take on men. The link play between our games is brilliant. So like there was a number of teams that kind of came out, and this is just very anecdotal at the moment because I need to completely go through it from an analysis point of view. But like skill wise, there was a noticeable difference in skill in the late maturing game. So I suppose there was an awful lot more passing, interlink play, communication with those players. The physical aspect was taken out of the game. So in other words, it was at a way more appropriate and mature level. So everyone was like, I'm marking a guy who's kind of at my own level or my own grade. So there were some of the kind of ideas from their perspective, and they just found it a really positive experience. They're like, it actually arms me more now when I go back training with the full group next week. I feel more confident, and I've definitely kind of it's made me think that way. The early maturing players and the opposite end, who are normally the big guys that were controlling the game, they found it really, really difficult. Some of the kind of quotes were like, I haven't played in as hard a game in I don't know how long. I couldn't run through the middle anymore. Every time I got the ball, there was someone on me. Like I couldn't kick the ball. Like, so this kind of a side of things. So the physical aspect was one. Then they were finding it like tactically that they were struggling a little bit more at times. And this is not ever in anyone, but it's just as a general feedback from maybe talking to maybe 8 to 10 of these players from either group.
That was Fionn Fitzgerald there talking to Mike Quirk on his podcast. Mark, would that suggest then that for those bigger, more physical, early maturing players, that they're not being armed for actually when they get towards senior level, that because they are bigger probably from a very young age, that it's almost all too easy for them for too long?
Yeah, possibly. And that can be physically and technically and tactically, but it can also be psychologically as well. And it can also be that maybe lack of resilience from challenge and setback, of maybe having it, kind of progressing quite easily through and not learning to deal with such setbacks. And what Fionn's talking about there is the process of biobanding, where instead of chronological age teams or groups, that through this process, perhaps a Calamus-Roach method, where we can see what percentage of your adult height you are. So, at you might be 80 to 85 or 86 to 90, and that's who you're put up against with those teams. It's a part of the toolkit. I think it's a good tool to maybe have a look at players. And what we can even do is we've often looked at fitness test results and scores, and actually use them to compare against people of your own maturational level, to give kids a kind of maybe a good oversight into where they are, comparing it not to necessarily people in their age group, but of their maturation level instead. So there's other ways of doing that. The Dutch FA have explored with the average age tournaments, where actually you have maybe an average age of a 13, but you could have 14-year-olds on it, you could have 12-year-olds on it, as long as the average age matches there. So they're all just parts of the toolkit. Like I would be a big proponent of, let's just give all the kids the experiences that they can, the 10,000 experiences rather than the 10,000 hours. And again, that's development, and it's challenge, and it's fun for kids as well. It's something the Danish FA are exploring with it's called their 2+1+1, where clubs will have their regular 2 hours training. They'll have one which is maybe a skill development hour, where clubs can join other clubs, or where regional development officers can come in. So that can be a specific hour. And then the last +1 is just the kids' hour. The gear is left, whatever the kids want is left on the side of the pitch, and it's all for the kids to play, and they're feeling autonomous, and that helps with their motivation and keeps them engaged in the sport. So there are more creative ways of doing things than maybe our traditional view of youth sport.
Mark, the reaction of the players there seems to feed into exactly what you're saying, that much more player-centred approach, so that bigger, more dominant players, you're actually looking at their individual game and maybe their spatial awareness or their vision or their teamwork and that side of it, and trying to improve that, rather than just looking at them when they're 14 and dominating and assuming that that's just going to carry through for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think I think, yeah, we're back to the idea again of just trying to identify at snapshots of times. These are really big issues we have. And I really liked what Laura said there. I think it's important that we remember that a lot of these interventions, like the really good intervention we just heard there, they're just part of a big puzzle, of a very big and complex puzzle. But I would urge people that work with younger children now, not just even in the growth spurt area of the teenage years, that even younger children try and keep mixing constellations of kids and give them different challenges as much as possible. This is what we've been doing since 2017, and we've had more kids staying in the game, and we've actually grown the club between 2017 and now grew with about 400 players because kids are staying on as well. So it's just giving them different challenges and being smart about it as well. You know, it's kids already know who's the best player, or what if they want to call him that. So yeah, there's lots of stuff there to work with, but there's no one solution, because if there was, we'd just be doing it all doing.
I think you touched on something earlier, Laura, about maybe the greater impact on players and children in terms of very early being exposed to that notion of the best player and the captain and the confidence that's instilled in that best player as a young child leading on to a teenager, and the player who maybe doesn't have the talent in that, and we put such an emphasis on sporting talent in this country that they end up being left behind, not just on the sports field, but maybe in other aspects of life, rather than benefiting from being around sport, actually being damaged by sport.
Yeah, I mean, kids will go into situations that they feel autonomous, like they have some say in what's going on, but that the social sphere of it as well, and that feelings of relatedness, and the other one feeling perceptions of their own competence, and that, you know, they're able to take on the challenge that you're providing them with as well. So like those are three really key things that we need to try and embed in what this youth sport looks like to keep them in the sport. When we often talk about sport being great and universally brilliant, but actually I don't know that it organically happens like that, and that everybody experiences that either. So I do think it is something that we need to be cognizant of, and that communication might come from parents as well, and you know, getting them on board with this. But that club culture and that really integration of efforts between the club, coaches and parents as well, I think is really important.
I think, Laura, there's also the issue of this maybe a kid that's early identified or just looked at early as the star player in this, that becomes a kind of a status badge. And then there are risks of it being a psychological ticking time bomb as well. You know, so there is the other issues, because as I've always say, is that when we're looking at doing early talent ID and stuff like that, talent is a graveyard of evidence. Nobody sees the dead bodies. And it's very much a game of survivorship bias, this. So we always look at the survivors in systems. So we have to be very careful as well. Is that, yeah, you may have some one or two young kids that are really good or look good or whatever, but the development of a status can also have very, very negative effects for that player as they grow and mature, and maybe grow very slowly at certain point of maturation, and others pass them out.
Fionn Fitzgerald was saying that the Premier League academies, when it comes to that biobanding and changing the setup at training, they maybe do 1 week a month of that, but it's regular training the rest of the time. If there's coaches listening in, Mark, who are looking for advice, is it to go and experiment, to try different things, try different setups, not give different environments for young players, so it's not the same players who are the star kids, the star players standing out all the time, that there's a spot for everybody?
Yeah, I think we really have to. I mean, I always say as many as possible, as long as possible, in as good environment as possible. The thing is, we have to ask ourselves, who is the sport for? It's for children and young people. That's who it's for, and that's our starting point with this. You know, you still remember that some clubs are, and I know I've heard of this in Ireland as well, are selecting kids that are young enough that actually some of them probably still believe in Santa Claus and they're being selected for academies. So, who is the sport for? We need to start there as well. Who is it for? But I would suggest try and keep your system open. Give as many different challenges as possible to the children, because it's all going to change, and it can change very quickly between individuals.
All right, we got to leave it there. Mark O'Sullivan, Head of Football at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, and Dr. Laura Finnegan, Lecturer and Researcher in Talent Development at the Southeast Technological University. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.